want to start with a remark on last night's lecture with Baju. Just something that crossed my mind. I was going to ask a question, but I was too tired. There's a good question about the relation to Nietzsche, and that sort of segue into where we left off yesterday afternoon, where we're going to pick up today. But we noticed at the end of in response to the question about Nietzsche yesterday, Badiou made the distinction between Wagner and Wagnerianism, Wagnerism, which is like the distinction that he'd make between Plato and Platonism. So Platonism might be any sort of, number of familiar prejudices about Plato, but Plato itself is something else. But then, it's then raises the question about the relationship of Nietzsche to Wagner, because Badiou was saying last night, well, it's not Nietzsche's opposition to Wagner is an opposition to Wagnerism, not an opposition to Wagner. And so it's not a question of Nietzsche contra Wagner, as Nietzsche said, but Nietzsche contra Wagnerism. And then the idea struck me that in terms of the 5 rules which Badiou gave us at the end of the talk last night, creating a possibility, multiplicity of hypotheses, tolerating a split subject, non-dialectical resoluteness and transformation without finality. Each of those concepts could be said to describe Nietzsche in the late work, the very late work. Because Nietzsche was a Wagnerian, right? In The Birth of Tragedy, paragraph 16 to 25, where he believed that the rebirth of tragedy was going to take place out of the spirit of not just music, but Wagnerian opera. And then in 1886, The Birth of Tragedy was written in 1872, in 1886, when he wrote the prefaces to his own work, which was, an extremely odd thing to do because no one was reading Nietzsche at this time. He was basically writing for himself. But there's this extraordinary text called Attempt at Self-Criticism by Nietzsche, where he criticizes his Wagnerism and talks about an artistan metaphysic, an artist metaphysics that was driving his early preoccupation with Wagner. And that was, and the model of the artwork, we're going to come back to this in the afternoon. The model of the artwork in The Birth of Tragedy is in terms of the coupling of Apollo and Dionysus. And that coupling is something that achieves a harmony or a reconciliation in the figure of Attic tragedy for Nietzsche. And it's that's given rebirth to in Wagnerian opera, according to the early Nietzsche. The late Nietzsche drops that, right, and drops Wagner. And also what drops out of Nietzsche is this whole category of the Apollinean. It becomes a question of the Dionysian. And then he begins to look for different musical models, right? And stumbles upon Bizet, because he happened to see Bizet's Carmen at the opera in Nice when he was spending his entirely sort of banal touristic winters on the French Riviera, along with all the other German tourists. There's nothing romantic about Nietzsche's winters, and this idea of him as this lofty. It's just what people, bourgeois Germans of that background, would have had their winters in Nice. The opera in Nice was playing Bizet. He went to see Bizet. Okay, that's the future of music, right? Not Wagnerian opera. He was desperate to find something. I've got a whole theory as to what that might have been. I mean, how we might think about a Nietzschean theory of music in relationship to popular music. I mean, not Elvis. I know that Wolfgang is a big fan of Elvis, but I've got a whole theory that I won't bore you with now about Because Nietzsche said he was born posthumously. So if we take that seriously, then his accounts of... And he also says something somewhere where, despite everything I say about Wagner, and I hate Wagner with a vengeance, he says, I still believe in the Dionysian future of music. What is the Dionysian future of music? Well, James Brown. And many other examples I could bore you with. But there's a whole number of things that cross my mind. But in terms of the very late Nietzsche, Ecce Homo, this last strange text that people read seriously, because you're 18 or 19 when you read it, and it's Nietzsche, and, God is dead, and, whoa. Whereas it's a comical text. Nietzsche wasn't stupid. So when he's writing chapters like why I write such excellent books, why I am a destiny, he's not being serious. And he says, and he puts the title of the book are the words that present Christ to Pilate. Right? Behold the man. So obviously Nietzsche in some ways identifying with Christ. That's a joke. The last words of the book are Dionysus against the crucified, have I been understood? The point of all that being that where Nietzsche ends up in his work is we begin with this in The Birth of Tragedy with this idea of the total artwork of Wagnerian opera as the rebirth of Greek tragedy. And in many ways the way I see Nietzsche's work is in terms of a progressive reduction of that ambition through to a text like Ecce Homo, where it's not a question of the rebirth of music and, as it were, a horde of masses, their faces bent to the dust while Wagner blares out, which is Nietzsche's image in The Birth of Tragedy, but an individual that cannot even be one, right? An individual that's radically split against itself. So this idea of the split subject that Badiou is presenting in relationship to Wagner, I think, is a very interesting picture of what Nietzsche's up to. Multiplicity of hypotheses and all the rest, and then this is sort of a way of getting back into the question of nihilism that I presented at the end of the session yesterday. Now, to go back to where we left things yesterday, then I want to present this diagram, present a discussion of ethical subjectivity and ethical experience, and then fill out this picture in hopefully a fairly convincing way, and then talk about Badiou as an example of what I'm up to, and then we can think about Badiou together. And then this afternoon I want to turn to ethics and aesthetics and the question of sublimation. But where we left things yesterday in terms of the question of nihilism, there is a quotation from The Will to Power. Let me just read it to you. Nietzsche says, as soon as the human being finds out how that world, the world of truth, is fabricated solely from psychological needs, and how he has absolutely no right to it, the last form of nihilism comes into being. It includes disbelief in any metaphysical world, God is dead, and forbids itself any belief in a true world. The world is an illusion. Having reached this standpoint, one grants the reality of becoming as the only reality. Becoming is the only reality. Forbids oneself every kind of clandestine access to afterworlds and false divinities, but cannot endure this world though one does not want to deny it. Cannot endure this world although one does not want to deny it. So the Nietzschean situation, and using this as a way of setting this question up, the experience of religious disappointment the death of God opens the problem of meaning. What might a meaning to life be in the absence of any transcendent guarantee like God or a God equivalent? Christianity is driven by this will to truth, as I mentioned yesterday, a will to truth that ends up undergoing an inversion. That will to truth discovers that what was believed in as true is untrue, there is no God, and this leads to a sudden affirmation of meaninglessness. And it's that affirmation of meaninglessness that Nietzsche called nihilism. Responses to nihilism can take different forms. Passive nihilism, the world is meaningless, I'll withdraw from it. We talked about that yesterday. Or active nihilism, the world is meaningless, I will destroy it and bring another world into being. And then there's also the CNN option, which we discussed yesterday. But Nietzsche's own position is, and this is where I want to begin today, can be thought of in terms of an ethic of endurance. It's a word that appears in his. It's a word that appears in his work in numerous places. He says, "To those human beings who are of concern to me, I wish suffering, desolation, and sickness, ill treatment, indignities. I wish that they should not remain unfamiliar with profound self-contempt." It's interesting. "The torture of self-mistrust, the wretchedness of the vanquished. I have no pity for them, because I wish them the only thing that can prove today whether one is worth anything or not, that one endures." Right? That one endures. So, in many ways, Nietzsche's thought is not nihilistic. It accepts, as it were, the metaphysical framework that nihilism gives us, but tries to present itself as a counter-movement to nihilism, which can be thought of around this question of endurance. How can one endure a world of becoming? And in many ways, what he tries to set up as a thought experiment is this idea of eternal return. If you can endure this world not just happening once, but happening, or endure this universe not just happening once, but happening repeatedly without meaning, aim, or purpose, then you might be the equivalent of the idea of eternal return. So Nietzsche's thought, ethical thought, it is an ethical thought, is a thought of endurance without any metaphysical guarantees. To that extent, and there are people that would disagree with this vigorously, but as I said, Nietzsche is like Talmud. Nietzsche is a kind of super Kantian, in the sense that for Kant, the only thing that matters is the moral law. And the moral law as that basis for universality, all my maxims of action have to run through the test of the moral law, whether they can be consistently generalized. But the feeling that the moral law produces in subjectivity, Kant says, in one word, is pain. Right? Schmerz. Right? That's the feeling of the moral law, which is similar to what Nietzsche was saying with "I wish on those that concern me, pain, suffering, desolation, profound self-contempt." But Kant can't dispense with the idea of God and the immortality of the soul. He knows these things are meaningless metaphysically, but they're still necessary morally. Otherwise, what might happen? Well, what might happen? And then we begin to run the question, well, what would humanity look like without a belief in the immortality of the soul? This is a question that Dostoevsky raises. And he says, without the immortality of the soul, we're sheep. No offence to sheep, but or something like that. Sea slugs, whatever, whatever. Flora and fauna. It's only the immortality of the soul that gives human beings a capacity for dignity. Now, the Nietzschean, as it were, thought experiment is whether one can really endure the world of becoming as a world of becoming without needing metaphysical guarantees of one kind or another. Now, so what's the meaning of that? Well, I set it up in those terms in order to present this side of the picture. So that having accepted the problem of nihilism, and so for me, and maybe I didn't make this clear enough yesterday, for me, why nihilism is so important is that it's the unifying concept in different forms, the unifying concept in continental thought for the last 200 years or so. The insight into nihilism. It's there in different forms in every significant thinker. Even those that disavow nihilism, like Adorno, it's still there. But and therefore, whatever the activity of thought might be, it has to be involved in a sort of thinking through the problem of nihilism and a counter-movement to it. So passive nihilism and active nihilism are just heuristic categories. They're little models which can be seen as responses to nihilism. I was saying this last night on the way down the hill, that, the fact that we can find, as Nico said yesterday, a position in between those, right? The Bartleby position that Zizek adopts or whatever, or we can think about different forms of active nihilism, that's fine. Right? The point of what one tries to do in thinking is to produce certain models, and those models will find objections. Right? And those objections will lead to reformulations of those models. That's just the way things go. There's not a model, right? But we can't do without a certain formal modelling when it comes to thinking or philosophy. So passive nihilism, active nihilism are little models which can be complicated. And what I want to present now is really the other side of this diagram, politics and ethics, and how these two things link up. So we're going to say goodbye to Nietzsche for a while. Anybody want to pick anything up in what I just said?
Could you say a little bit more about the beginning philosophy begins in discipline?
Right.
Touched on that a little bit yesterday.
Yeah, I didn't really explain it, did I? There's a moment there's a poem by Coleridge called Dejection, an Ode, where Coleridge, at a certain point in the poem, talks about his experience of nature. Translate this into these terms: the blue sky, the mountains, the order which we seem to find in beauty, the beauty of our experience of nature. And Coleridge says we want to project that onto the thing itself. Right? We want to believe that the order and the beauty that we experience in order in relationship to nature is a reflection of nature in itself. But we can't. It's just for us. who knows what those mountains are doing or thinking. So there's a romantic, the romantic experience in someone like Coleridge comes out of an experience of dejection with regard to nature. We find nature beautiful, harmonious. We still yearn after, if not God, then some sort of unifying principle of nature that would allow us to unify with that. Right? But we can't. We draw back from that. Or again, another way of thinking about this in relation to what Badgie was talking about last night, when we were talking over dinner, the tragic paradox. I mentioned Empedocles yesterday, and I was reading Hölderlin's Death of Empedocles on vacation, as I said. And the paradox of tragedy for Hölderlin is the following. It is, on the one hand, the one hand that there is a human being who is capable of a union with the divine in the form of nature, and that's the tragic hero. That's what Empedocles represents for Hölderlin. Right? So he, through the activity of thought and politics, was able to become the God-drunken man. Right? The God-drunken man. That's one side of the paradox. The other side of the paradox is the withdrawal from that. So Hölderlin's tragedy, The Death of Empedocles, presents Empedocles after, as it were, the god has withdrawn from him. And he's left alone, dejected, and contemplating his suicide, which is what's enacted in the drama. Or again, to give another classical example, which again was very important at the end of the 18th century, Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound. Right? The drama of Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound is that Prometheus is chained to a rock by might and violence. There's a character called Violence in Aeschylus who says nothing. It's fascinating. He's a mute presence on stage. Violence. And Prometheus, who is a god, right, but who is in conflict with the gods that win, Zeus, and is a god, but decides out of pity for human beings to give them the gift of fire, and thereby, with the gift of fire, to give them technology. Right? So the origin of technology and all the rest that goes with it is Promethean. It's a gift from the gods. And also, he said, what I also gave human beings was the gift of prophecy, how to detect, how to read the future from the entrails of birds. And also, I gave them the ability to, I gave them the capacity for happiness in order to disguise themselves from the fact of doom. Prometheus knows that it's just doom all the way down, but in giving fire to human beings who at that point were under the ground, blind, insect-like, he gives human beings technology, prophecy, and the capacity to believe that all is not doom, happiness. Blind hopes. He said, I gave them blind hopes. The best thing I gave human beings. Anyway, Prometheus is pictured after having engaged in this act of hubris and is tortured. So the activity of tragedy is the tragic hero is that person who identifies with the divine, who becomes divine, and in the tragedy we see them in their withdrawal and separation from the divine. Little like what happened with the Tannhauser description last night in Badiou. Philosophy begins in disappointment is that thought. It's that thought of tragic separation. I'd love to be a Spinozist. I'd love to be a Deleuzian. I'd love that. I'd love to believe that there was just endless plane of immanence and multiple lines of flight and becomings, and the whole thing was there, vibrating with life, and I could participate with it. But I don't believe it. I can conceive of it in thought, but fuck, I mean, you know, what is this carcass, this thing that you're stuck with, this self-lacerating contempt that we call a mental life? You know, that's where we are. Separation, anxiety, sin, all that awful stuff. So disappointment is something like that thought, that we still have the yearning after that as a grand picture, but it's not for us. So, so for me, this is why, you know, romanticism and romantic poetry. I know that Judith Bazot is doing some Hölderlin in her class. This is why this is so important to me, because romanticism is the moment when there is the memory of that, if you like, totality, and the recognition of separation from it. So disappointment is that melancholy recognition of human limitation as the beginning for philosophy.
Sorry, I just had one question. I think the examples you had given is God different from religion?
Say more.
What shall I say more?
Well, say it's a very... I don't want to say yes or no. I want to say that more.
Well, God is different from religion, and oftentimes God is spoken of in context with religion, and Christ is different than Christianity, and Christ is often automatically linked with Christianity, so there's massive confusion, and I'm just wondering if, in any of the examples you've given, if God is simply different than a religion.
Well, I'd say that most religions, right? Obviously, the three Abrahamic monotheisms are religions bound around the positing of a transcendent God. Okay? So, for most of human history in our corner of the planet, religion has been dependent upon some conception of the divine. There can be religion without divinity.
Can there be divinity without religion, though?
I don't know, what would the point of that be? There could be. I mean, there could be a God out there who we don't...
Why do you look out there when you say that?
It's nice down here. Oh, right, in there or in
You
there?
should be like, oh my God. Like,
or in here, yeah.
Yeah. No, anyway. Just curious.
Yeah, there could be a God in here or out there that we don't, that has no set of religious rituals around them. Yeah. But is that sort of what's on the mind?
Yeah, it's sort of what's on my mind.
And there's I mean, for me, it's, you know, religious disappointment is important as a starting point, because it's there's still the memory of what there's the memory in that of what religion promised, right? Which we can't have. Although the memory of that is still has a powerful function historically. Let me turn to... So that's what I mean by disappointment. An experience of limitation. So philosophy doesn't begin in wonder, it begins... this is my recommendation, it's not, you know... The truth begins from an experience of failure and lack. One senses that things are not simply wonderful. The two main forms of disappointment that I analyse are religious and political. I've discussed the first side of this, let me discuss the second side of it a little bit. So that the other side of disappointment that I'd like to think about is political disappointment. Political disappointment begins from the very simple thought that we inhabit a world that's defined by injustice. there is a world of violent injustice. There's a world where blood is being spilt in the merriest way, as though it were champagne, as Dostoevsky says. So, what does the fact of injustice lead us to? It leads us to the question of justice. The question of justice. And this is very much, going back to what I presume, talking with him last night, Badiou was talking about in relationship to Plato, that in Plato's Republic, we have an established order of politics, the way in which the polis is regulated. And the philosopher is that person who finds that order unjust, and who finds the various conceptions of justice which that political order uses to legitimate itself as unjust. Which then leads the philosopher to raise the question, what is justice? Book 1 of the Republic, Badiou is translating at the moment, right? Is Socrates runs through the various conventional views of justice. Justice is giving each person their due, so on and so forth. He, in 20, 30 pages, demolishes each of those conceptions of justice. Then that leads to the question, well, what is justice? And that question we never get an answer to in Plato. It's got something to do with the good, whatever that is. That's never defined. And at certain points in the Republic, Glaucon asks Socrates, what do you mean by justice? What do you mean by the good? He says, well, I can't tell you what the good is, but I can give you an image of the good, or a series of images of the good. The cave, the sun, the divided line, the central images in the Republic. The point of that being that so philosophy on this picture begins in an experience of injustice, which then raises the question of justice, and that question of justice isn't necessarily resolved simply. But it leads to, in my view, the need for ethics. Why does ethics, as something separate from politics, arise? It arises when we experience the disjunction of thought from political reality. And now I want to run down this side of the diagram a little bit more and try to explain what I mean. Let me back up just a second. Let me try and give a sort of, make a claim about where we are at the present moment. The thing about nihilism is that both passive nihilism and active nihilism, I think, are inadequate responses to the way in which the world is, but they're accurate descriptions of the way in which the world is. There's an accuracy to them. And thinking about that in relationship to contemporary liberal democracy, I want to talk about, briefly, or mention what I call a motivational deficit at the heart of liberal democracy. I think that we can think about our relationship to the institutions and habits of liberal democracy in terms of this motivational deficit. What do I mean by that? This is the classical philosophical problem of externalism versus internalism. My claim would be that we experience the order of justice that governs, say, liberal democratic societies. We experience those moral claims as externally compelling, but not internally compelling. So you find this in particular, say, in our experience of law. So law is what regulates the political order. Okay? In a liberal democracy, it's not philosophers that are kings, but lawyers. Okay? and the highest political agency in a liberal democracy is the Supreme Court. And what is the purpose of the Supreme Court? It is to offer interpretations of law. Interpretations of law which are then passed down as decrees, decisions. Our experience of law is not an experience of something that is internally compelling, that we're internally motivated to, but it's something externally there. We recognise that there's a framework of law, a penal code, say, a legal code, which governs life, which we might recognise. We might, in our fancy, think it reflects certain fundamental rights, a Bill of Rights, and so on and so forth. But I think the crisis of liberal democracy is that the moral claims of our society have become externally compulsory, but not internally compelling. So there is a motivational gap or a motivational deficit at the heart of the political order of liberal democracy. Citizens seem to experience a distance with regard to the state, institutions, and all the rest of the apparatus of government in the societies in which they live. This is what's called by some political theorists democratic deficit. Right? There's a democratic deficit that, for whatever reason, this is particularly the case in Western Europe, the membership of political parties has dropped radically over the last 20 years. Less and less people are involved in politics, more and more people feel alienated from traditional politics, normal politics as it were, and there's sort of an experience of drift, slackening, and all the rest. This then raises the question, political question, of how we might think about an experience of commitment or something internally compelling that might project us back into forms of political life. So, the experience of motivation, so the claim is, the sort of descriptive claim, is that what describes, how we might describe life in liberal democracy at the present time is in terms of an overwhelming motivational deficit. That motivational deficit leads to the question, well, how might we motivate a subject to act ethically or engage politically? How might we begin to conceive of that? And this then leads me to a question, well, how is it that subjects become motivated to act morally at all? Right? How does that take place? What sort of experience is that? We sort of take that for granted.
Can you define ethics and moral?
Yeah, I will in a second, yeah. I don't make a hard and fast distinction between ethics and morality.
Okay.
One is a Greek etymology, one's a Latin etymology. I mean, there are various thinkers that make a distinction, like Habermas and others, but I think there's no sort of hard and fast distinction. You can say, well, ethics relates to ethos, it can relate to disposition, habit, it can be a local idea of intuitions, patterns of behaviour in a locality, whereas morality can be more of a system. I thought that doesn't really hold up historically. So for me, there's no hard and fast distinction between ethics and morality. Ethics, what the question for me, the fundamental question of ethics for me, and this is where I want to. So if there is a situation of political disappointment which raises the question of justice and an experience of motivational deficit, and this raises the need for something like ethics. What is the fundamental ethical question? What is the fundamental ethical question? The fundamental ethical question the fundamental ethical question, I was going to say for me, but I don't think it's just for me, is how does a relate itself to some experience of the good. Right? So the fundamental ethical question is, how does a self relate itself to some experience of the good? Let's just begin there. Is it a question?
Yeah, I'm curious about this idea of the democratic deficit, and you're talking about how people have dropped out of political parties in alarming numbers over the last 20 years.
In Western Europe in
In
particular.
Western Europe, and I would argue probably in North America to some degree as well.
Obama puts a wrinkle in that, or puts a wrinkle. 2008 was an interesting wrinkle in that story. But yeah.
But I'm wondering, does that necessarily imply a democratic deficit? Because it seems to me that in parallel with that has been an extreme explosion of grassroots movements
Yes.
and potentialities
Yes.
that suggest that democracy hasn't gone anywhere. In fact,
Yes.
there's a deficit, it's in the system itself.
Precisely. Absolutely. The democratic deficit is with regard to the identification of democracy, say, with the state form. Right? The flip side of that democratic deficit, the flip side of that motivational deficit with regard to, as it were, normal politics, has been an extraordinary explosion of motivation at the level of other forms of politics. So I think that's precisely right. That's an important point. And the two things are correlated. So insofar as citizens feel alienated from the state, I mean, that can lead to passive nihilism and Beetaloo and the rest. But it can also lead to an extraordinary explosion of new forms of political agency, new social movements, and all the rest. And that's one way of reading. That's one way of reading politics, really, from the mid-70s onwards. You could take this back quite a long way. You could say, well, what happens in the mid-70s onwards is that forms of state-based parties with widespread popular appeal begin to break down. What begins to emerge in there are new forms of social movements where political identity can be based on, not uniquely, say, on class factors, but on issues like gender, race, so on and so forth. And there's a whole, we could fill that out in a very persuasive way. As descriptions, say, of forms of rainbow coalition politics in the 80s and the rest. And fast forwarding, this is stuff which has been of significant interest to me over about 10 years ago in particular. I mean, how we think about the so-called anti-globalization movement. Right? This would be, on the one hand, the recognition of motivational deficit with regard to normal politics and the explosion of a motivating and motivated politics in other forms. Very crudely, is that the state is a limitation on human existence. It's my sort of basic axiom. The state is a limitation on human existence, and I'm therefore some sort of anarchist. Right? Okay. And I'm very interested, always have been very interested in forms of non-state-based organisation, which find their most compelling articulation in the anarchist tradition, rather than in the Marxist tradition, which for me has always been too wedded to the state form. Right? Think of Bakunin's critique of Marx, where he says, Marx really is the good German, the crypto-Bismarckian, with a love affair of the state, love affair with the state. So that's as it were, first postulate. Can we imagine society without the state at this point in history? We could discuss that, or we could begin to do some anthropological work or serious ethnographic work and look around and think about that. There are different views in the overfed Western democracies at this point in history. It's difficult to imagine entirely non-state-based forms of political involvement, but here's one thought you could think about. I mean, there are debates there were debates in the EU. I'm no particular lover of the EU, but there were debates in the EU which would begin with the idea that the state form is passé, the nation state is a thing of the past, and what has to be brought about is a form of federalism, right? A radical form of federalism. Now, the anarchist tradition from Bakunin onwards has been concerned with one thing, and that's federalism. Right? Federalism conceived of as a form of locally autonomous groups in some sort of federated structure. One fanciful romantic vision for the EU, which is certainly not going to happen anytime in the next decades, would be the total collapse of the nation state and the emergence of local forms of government in some sort of federated order. Okay, but that's probably not going to happen. So, is society without the state is conceivable? Yes. Is it practicable? Probably not at this point in history. So, what's to be done then? I mean, what I try and think about is an idea of politics as, this is something I take from Badiou and I twist a certain way, because Badiou also, at a certain point in the early 80s, abandoned identification with the state and with the party, right? And began to talk about a politics without party and outside of the state. And this then can be thought of as the theme of politics as taking a distance from the state. Distance from the state. Now, I don't want to go into the debate with Zizek, I'll wait till Sunday for that, but this is something that's very much at the heart of that debate I've had with Zizek. I mean, what does it mean to take a distance from the state? My view is that politics, in the sense that you were just talking about it, can be seen as the creative capacity to create forms of distance within the state. Right? And here we face a paradox. There is no distance within the state. Right? The state saturates more and more areas of social life. Right? If we think about the example of, I don't know, London, if you travel from one side of London to the other, you're photographed, whatever, 38 times or something like that. Right? So we live in societies with extraordinary levels of surveillance and control, and where social space is increasingly saturated by state or state-based forms or state-linked forms of control. So distance is not given. Right? One of the things that Slavoj criticises me for is to imagine that we can, as it were, leave the state and go somewhere else. That's not my claim at all. The work of politics is the creation of distance within the state form. Right? This is what I call interstitial distance, the creation of interstitial distance. And I've got various examples of this. I don't know whether to go into this now. It wasn't what I was planning to do. It was a good thing, it was a bad thing. Which thing?
Good.
Yeah, all right. I had my plan. Okay. Let me give an example. This goes back to the question yesterday about, I mean, for me, so you know, I've got a romantic anarchist core to my being. But on the other hand, I've always been deeply attracted to a figure like Gramsci, much more than, say, Lenin. I've never been that keen on. It's always too macho for me. But Gramsci, it seems, grasped the nature of politics in an incredibly powerful way. Politics is the practical construction of fronts, of blocks, based on what there is on the ground. Right? Now, why did Gramsci come to that position? Well, there was the First World War, right? And if you were a Marxist in 1913, and you were more or less less subscribed to the Marxism of the Second International, you believed, let's say, that the dialectic between the forces of production, human labour, and the relations of production, at that time industrial capitalism, would lead to a contradiction that would emerge as revolution. Right? And that once the workers got sight of that, then the whole bourgeois order would collapse, and there would be proletarian revolution leading to communism. Instead, there was the First World War. Right? And the First World War, the proletariat, rather than rising up against their authorities, slaughtered each other in the name of national identity. Happily. Germans slaughtering the British, slaughtering the French, happily slaughtering each other in the interests of the ruling class. So given that happened, what possible implications might one draw from that situation for politics? And that's the situation that Gramsci faced in the early 1920s in Italy. Given that the proletarian revolution was not going to happen in the way in which we imagine Marx had anticipated, although in Marx these things are pretty obscure. There's no political theory in Marx. But things didn't work out. What of politics? And Gramsci comes to the view that, firstly, that the idea that there is a radical distinction between base and superstructure has to break down. Right? So the classical Marxist view that, as Clinton would say, it's the economy stupid, the idea that socioeconomic forces are what really govern things, and ideology is just so much froth or foam floating above that just won't do. Politics requires ideological articulation. It requires dealing with not just socioeconomic issues, but all sorts of other things. So Gramsci was obviously trained as a linguist, was concerned with the language of politics, with the function of signifiers in politics, and was prepared to think about non-Marxist influences, Italian Hegelianism, was prepared to accept that there was an emancipatory potential, say, within forms of religious belief that could be harnessed to a socialist cause, and so on and so forth. The point being that for Gramsci, politics is that ideological operation which pulls together what there is on the ground into a certain front, into a certain block, and tries to do something with it. Right? So it's a pragmatic activity in that regard. Now, to go back to the example. An example. Mexican example. As you will know, the main category of opposition in Mexican politics, early decades of the 20th century, was the category of peasant. Right? Peasant mobilized the peasant as a category that was mobilized as the basis for a popular front and forms of activist politics. All the rest. Now, in the early 1980s, the government of Salinas in Mexico, under pressure from the US and the IMF, was requested to get Mexico's business in order and to try and clamp down on certain political groups. So those groups that had mobilized around the idea of peasant and peasantry were incarcerated, rendered illegal, so on and so forth, the usual thing. What then happened? Well, what then happened was that the Mexican government had signed up more or less unwittingly to an international labour convention, International Labour Convention 162 or 182, which said that the government of Mexico is bound to respect the rights of indigenous peoples. That clause was then taken by certain Mexican activists as the basis for a new political articulation. So the category of peasant, as it were, have been rendered unusable, illegal, marginalised, and the category of indigeneity, and indigenous politics, became mobilised. There's a wonderful book on this topic by Courtney Young, used to be a colleague of mine at the New School. It's a political ethnographic study of the emergence of indigenous politics in Mexico. That's really what I'm basing this on. And so, and then the point being that as a consequence of that, the category of indigeneity became the category around which a new political articulation could be based. That is what I mean by politics as the creation of interstitial distance within the state. So you take something like a signifier, indigeneity, and that signifier can become the basis for the creation of a new political space. And the consequences of the creation of that political space, indigeneity, has been to the emergence of, say, the UN Forum on Indigenous Rights, the way in which South American politics has been increasingly organised around indigeneity, Morales and the rest, and so on and so forth. I mean, the detail of this, I'm not a Latin Americanist, and I don't pretend to be. The point is more of a structural one. Is that politics is about the location of some term, some signifier, some name around which a space can be articulated, a group can be articulated. I mean, there were, indigenous people in Mexico before this period, right? But indigeneity becomes a category after the fact. That, as it were, retrospectively is used to open that new political space. Another example would be an example that Jacques Rancière gives in a text that he wrote on human rights. It's an interesting text. Would be the example of the French woman Olympe de Gouges, who after the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, after that declaration, the French Revolution, says, well, if men can claim rights, then what about rights for women? Right? So once that signifier has been mobilised politically, rights of man, then does rights of man include or exclude rights for women? And that can then be used as the basis for a new interstitial articulation, the creation of a discourse of women's rights, which happened with Olympe de Gouges in France, it happened with Mary Wollstonecraft in England. Politics is like that. Right? Politics is about the articulation of names and signifiers, which are then filled with a certain meaning, and which can be the basis for an articulation. Right? And if that articulation has some appeal to, as it were, facts on the ground, which have a deep, sort of visceral sense to people there, all the better. But politics is that sort of operation for me. Badiou's great theme is the question, is there a political name at this moment in history? Do we have a political name? And his answer is, no, we don't. There's always that moment in Badiou where, on the one hand, we get this extraordinary optimism and robust affirmativeness, and they'll say, well, actually, There's no name. Like at the end of the lecture last night on Wagner. Because if we think about, let me take another example. In 1843, Marx, the young Marx, in his essay Introduction to Hegel's Philosophy of Right, comes up with the category proletariat. And the category proletariat, he then says, will be the basis for that political articulation that he goes on to call communism. So what is Marx's political thought? It's the identification of this class called the proletariat, and the identification of that class with this thing called communism. Now, did the proletariat exist? Well, yes, right? There was, as Engels had shown in the emergence of the working class in England, there was in England the emergence of an industrial working class that we could call classically the proletariat. But that, you see the way it works, but once the signifier is put into place, as it were, you then, as it were, create a political agency that retrospectively finds justification with reference to an existing state of affairs. Look, there are these people working in the mills of the northwest of England. These are the proletariat. This is where society is going, and these will be the agents of communist revolution. And then, after the fact, or a century after Marx, we imagine these things are somehow given, and somehow, as it were, written in stone. But it's an act of the point being is what Marx did was an act of political invention, political creation. And so politics, for me, always has that. That's its fundamental operation. And I think it then becomes a question of thinking about names in relationship to politics. I think the key signifier of the next 20 years or so in the US and in Europe is going to be the signifier immigrant, and what immigration means. How does one mobilize that category immigrant politically, in a way, and who will mobilize that category? And it's far from clear in the US context who's going to mobilize that category best. Because one of the strange paradoxes of, say, W, right, was his sensitivity to that issue. Much more so than the Democratic Party at the time. So, if you're looking, I think if you're looking around for where politics is going to happen over the next 20 years or so, would be how is that category of immigrant mobilized politically? How is its energy harnessed and focused in a certain way? That debate in the US takes a certain form, obviously, the relationship, particularly to Mexican immigration, and it takes a different form in Western Europe, and in particular around Islamophobia and all the rest. But that seems to be one point of serious political articulation at the present moment. What name is going to describe that, harness that? I don't know. Is that going to be a politics of the right or a politics of the left? At this point, it's really unclear.
But there is to be no name for what the dude proposes, right? Because it's this potentiality for, I don't want to use the right word, the basis of different hypotheses, so multiplicity can exist and experiments can happen and new ways are created. There's not necessarily a name to be given.
Badiou will claim that we need a name. I mean, there is that there's that multiplicity of hypotheses and all the rest. There is a situation where the global is unstable and all the rest. But there's the need for a name. Right? Will there be a name, like proletariat? Or will there be a multiplicity of names? Will there be different names in different localities? That's another way of thinking about it. We'll come back to that. And Badgew's emphasis on the local is very important. But we're not making much progress here. So let me. We are. It's all sort of. When our obsessional desire for order is being inverted, which is probably a good thing, gets me thinking. But let's go back to this question of ethics, and then I want to move on to Badiou. So the fundamental question of ethics, on my view, is the relationship of the self to some conception of the good. Relation of the self to some conception of the good. What do I mean about that? What do I mean by that? I'll come back to this later. Two little models. Again, these are models which can be, they're just thumbnail sketches, they're not universal laws. Right? These are ones you can find in Infinitely Demanded, if you get so disposed to look at that. This is ethical experience, this is ethical subjectivity. Approval and demand, self and good. Okay. What's the claim? The claim is that an ethical subject is the name for the way in which a self binds itself to some conception of the good. Ethical subject is a name for the way in which a self binds itself to some conception of the good. At this point, that notion of the good is entirely empty. Right? Entirely empty. I'll fill it out later.
How about if my conception of the good is going against the state?
That's fine. That's your conception of the good. But let me give you some examples. So by good at this point, I mean something entirely empty. Let me fill it in with different examples. Let me say one more thing before I do the examples. At the core of ethical subjectivity, I want to claim this idea of the self relating itself to some conception of the good, are these two concepts of approval and demand. For me, the core operation of ethics consists in the subjective experience of something that places a demand on the self, which the self approves. That's it. The fundamental experience of ethics is that experience of a demand that demands approval. Which is to say that ethical experience is always circular. It has to be circular, otherwise the demand would be coercive. If I said to you, the good is fish, right? And that is the law, your approval is irrelevant. I simply coerce that of you. But to do that would be to override any conception of freedom you might have. Our experience of the law is like that. Right? Laws are customarily written in the third person, they have an impersonal formulation, and they're coercive demands that are valid irrespective of whether one approves of them or not. Right? So if you look at the US Penal Code on murder, murder is murder. Whether you approve of that or not is neither here nor there. That's law. But ethics is something else. Ethics requires some experience of a demand that I approve of. Now, in the... let me fill this out with some examples. To go back to Plato, who we mentioned. The demand in Plato is the demand of the good. To be a philosopher, or a guardian for Plato, is to be a person who orientates their soul towards the good. Right? The good that's beyond being, the good that cannot be spoken of directly, that's given to us in various images, the cave and all the rest, but the good. For the Christian, to be a Christian is to... The good for a Christian is the experience or to commit oneself in faith to Christ. Right? Christ becomes that good, that demand that I approve of as the basis for faith, which would be my fundamental ethical orientation. For Kant, that demand is the demand of what he calls the moral law. The moral law is the law. It's universal. But the highest principle in ethics for Kant is the principle of autonomy. That means that the only law that I can subject myself to is a law that I freely choose. Otherwise, it would be coercive. So autonomy, to be autonomous, is to approve of the demand of the moral law for Kant. And for that moral law to become viscerally felt in my person, for Kant. That's the trick of morality there. Now, Plato, Christianity, Paul or Augustine, Kant. In the first two examples, the demand is a demand that comes from outside. It's a heteronymous demand. It's the demand of God in the form of Christ. It's the demand of the good, which is a transcendent existence. In Kant, the demand is the demand of autonomy. So that what changes in modern conceptions of ethics is that the ethical experience derives from a demand that has to be the demand that I lay upon myself, like the law that I give myself, autonomy. Now, this is, crudely in philosophical jargon, a meta-ethical model. This is a little piece of meta-ethics. Meta-ethics as that discipline or that area of moral philosophy that is concerned with, is not concerned with specific normative claims as to what to do, but is concerned with what makes ethics the kind of thing that ethics is. Right? What makes ethics the kind of thing that ethics is? Now, my claim is that if you look back through the history of philosophy, religious thought and political thought, you'll find something doing the work of a demand that's approved of. Right? Something that has the place of the good that the self binds itself to. I mean, that can be in Kant the moral law. That can be in the Marquis de Sade, what he calls in his late work the right to orgasm. Right? So the Sardian version of Kant, which is why Lacan was so accurate in seeing that connection, or Blanchot saw it too, way back in the 50s. So what does it mean to be a sadist? To be a sadist means to approve of the demand of the universal right to orgasm, right? Le droit de jouir, Sartre called it, which means that every human being, every time and every location has the right to sexual satisfaction whenever and wherever they choose. Right? So to be a bad sadist is to not follow up on that demand. The point being that for the sadist and the Kantian, morality has the same structure, although the content of that morality is different. Right? The sadist, Marquis de Sade had this idea of the construction of sex houses across Paris where people would be able to exercise the right to orgasm. Now Kant would have found that a difficult thought to tolerate. My point is that they essentially have the same structure, Kant and Sade. It's both. So morality always has this, always comes down to something which has the function of a demand, which I approve of, and in binding myself to that demand, that perception of the good, I become an ethical subject. That's the key operation. There's a question.
Where does Sade go into all that? Those texts?
It's in a late... Oh, God, I can't remember. I'll find it for you. It's a late text. I think it's in Republicans... there's this text in Encore un effort. Once, where does it talk about that? It's the text where he talks about, to be Republican, encore un effort pour être républicain. Right? One effort more to be Republican. I try and remember I'll try and find the reference. I have it somewhere in a footnote. The point being that the Marquis de Sade and Kant are equally moral in that sense. They're equally moralistic pictures of the way things are. The content of their morality happens to differ. But that's, at this point, is neither here nor there. My meta-ethical claim is that more or less, every philosopher, political thinker, theologian, whatever, has something doing the work of a demand which is approved of. Well, name your favourite philosopher, and we'll try and find Zizek. It's the... well, it could be seen in different ways. It would be, it would be the demand that the Bartlebian demand, not to give in to the incessant call to action. The demand to withdraw and reflect in one version of it, or it could be you could give that a certain or insofar as he's Lacanian, the fundamental demand in Lacanian terms is ne pas céder sur son désir, do not give way on its desire, which is the formula of unconscious desire. So for a Lacanian like Zizek, it becomes a question of how we link our subjective life to the life of desire, and not to give way on that. So another good text to look at here would be the Lacan's Ethics of Psychoanalysis, which has exactly the same structure. For Lacan, the figure of someone like Antigone is a moral exemplar. She is that being who does not give way on the moral demand that makes her the person that she is, and she will stay with that demand all the way to her death. Right? That's a moral disposition. Again, it has a different character, different content rather, but it's the same structure. That's my point. Bataille, sovereignty. Be sovereign. Do not be servile. Right? Do not be servile. Do not bind your subjectivity to the principle of utility or the claims of knowledge. Be sovereign. Be sovereign. That's as moral a demand as any other, just as a different concept. Well, Levinas is easy. And, of course, a favourite of mine. For Levinas, the fundamental moral operation is to bind oneself to the demand of the other's face. Right?
Precisely, but when the demand is outside of the self.
Yeah, well, this is where it gets more complicated. Okay. Good point. Bataille. Bataille was... Bataille wanted people to be sovereign, right? To commit their existence to the possibility of sudden moments of sovereign authority. Right? Eroticism, tragedy, laughter, buying a yacht. I'm not joking about the yacht. I've got a whole thing about Bataille and luxury. That's just a thing about Bataille. It's interesting because Bataille's opposition to the principle of utility and also his suspicion of communism in various texts leads him to, and his understanding of Nietzsche leads to a certain affirmation of squandering. Right? So to be sovereign is to squander. So what is to be servile is to reduce everything to need and use, and that's what communists do. That's how that works. To be sovereign is to squander. Who squanders? Kings squander beautifully, lavishly. Right? Aristocrats, warriors squander. In our age, hedge fund investors squander. They're the Bataille squanderers.
Does
Anyway.
squandering have to be so material?
Well, but often for Bataille it becomes a sheer sort of excessive use of stuff, right? Anyway, the point being is so for Bataille, as for Kant, sovereignty is a principle of autonomy of some sort. Right? In Nietzsche, who I mentioned, if to be the equivalent of, for Nietzsche, the question would be how does one affirm, say, the thought of eternal return, relentlessly. That would be the demand that's placed on you, which you have to approve of. For Levinas, it's the same structure, but slightly different. For Levinas, the fundamental moral operation, as I said, is that there is an experience of the other's face which places me under an obligation. And for Levinas, that obligation is something that happens against my will, something that happens despite myself. So what you find in Levinas, this interests me enormously, is a certain return to a notion of heteronomy. Right? So this is something I argue for this in Infinitely Demanding and elsewhere. There is an autonomy orthodoxy in modern philosophy. So if in Kant the principle of autonomy is how I become the subject of the moral law, what happens after Kant is different thinkers giving different, trying to finesse that thought of autonomy in different ways. So Fichte says, well, the Kantian idea of autonomy is great, but he gives up on the idea of intellectual intuition. Intellectual intuition for Fichte simply becomes the act of the subject. Right? So for Fichte, the moral demand is the act that I lay myself under in becoming a subject. But it's also a thought of autonomy. For Hegel, Hegel will claim, well, Kantianism is is a form of morality which is socially and historically empty, and it's important to fill that void up with accounts of recognition, life and death struggle, and all the rest. But for Hegel, autonomy takes on the form of intersubjectivity. It becomes an intersubjective idea of autonomy. Autonomy is not just my autonomy, it's the autonomy I share with others in a community. And that then leads to a Marxist idea of autonomy, which becomes the idea of communism, and so on and so forth. So what's dominated the last couple of hundred years of moral thinking, political thinking, is an autonomy orthodoxy, right up to people like Habermas, Hollis and the rest. What you find in Levinas is the idea that the fundamental ethical procedure has to work against frustrate my autonomy in some way. And I find that an amenable thought. Maybe I'll come back to that. Anybody else? The favourite?
You do Heidegger.
Well, Heidegger, it's the call of conscience in Being and Time. Right? It's crystal clear. For Heidegger, to be is to be in debt. Right? It's the fundamental fact of guilt. Facticity that's described inauthenticity described in Division 1 of Being and Time. The point is to be authentic. Authenticity only comes through, authenticity for Heidegger only, because there is no God, only comes through being the equivalent, or attempting to be the equivalent to the demand that finitude places on my being. Right? So the question of Heidegger doesn't talk about morality or ethics, of course, in Being and Time, but the fundamental moral operation here would be found in being towards death. So the limit of my being is death, being towards death. The experience of conscience for Heidegger would be the internalization of that being towards death as the experience of finitude. And to affirm that is to be authentic. Can that be sustained? Well, Heidegger thinks no. There can be moments of mastery of the everyday, the inauthentic, but that can't be sustained. And there'd be a different story for the later Heidegger, but there's still something doing that work.
I will actually have to agree.
So that I find this a compelling model. What can I say? I mean, and you can do it almost as detective work. You can look at any theorist or thinker that you're working with and ask the question: well, what is the demand that is organising their work? What is the fundamental thing which is organising the entire system? Right? Foucault, right? Becomes an idea of care for the self in the late Foucault, right? Which is another version of autonomy. Makes it perfectly clear. It's what Judith Butler calls Foucault's neo-stoicism in the late work. See, so that's my meta-ethical picture. I wish I had a break. I'm going to come back and... Now, let's do... Give me 2 more minutes, and then we'll come back after the break and just focus on Badiou. I want to finish this argument and then put it to bed until this afternoon, and then talk about Badiou in a relaxed and jovial way after the break. So that the... whatever morality is, whatever ethics is, and we haven't defined that yet, the fundamental experience of ethics concerns this notion of the ethical subject, and that demand in relationship to which an ethical subject constructs itself, articulates itself. So for me, the fundamental task of morality is the construction of an ethical subject. And I've got a peculiar vision of what such a subject might be, which I'll lay out in 2 minutes. But first, just make a clarification here. It's important to be clear, I think, at this point, as to when we're talking about ethics, politics, and aesthetics, and other wonderful humane issues, what the status is of the remarks that we're making. Logic proceeds by the construction of truths which are valid by virtue of their form. Right? Empirical natural science proceeds by propositions that are valid by virtue of their experiential verification. Right? Ethics and politics and aesthetics are not in those language games. You can identify certain structures, as I've tried to do here, which have a certain force, I think. But what one is in the business of doing in this sort of work, normatively, is offering recommendations. You offer recommendations. Those recommendations can be accepted or not accepted. That's up to you. To do anything else would be to coerce you or cajole you into a certain way of thinking, which is not what we're up to. That's an important proviso. My recommendation is the following. I try to construct an ethical subject based around 4 concepts that I take from 4 different thinkers. The first concept is the idea of the subject committing itself in fidelity to a universal demand. Subject committing itself in fidelity to a universal demand. And that's the claim that I borrow in a certain way from Badiou. Right? So for me, the richness of Badiou's thought is that, we'll come back to this after the break, is that ethics has to be an ethics of situations, right? Not abstractions, but it can't be reduced to a situation. There has to be something that's doing the work of a general claim, a universal demand. So fidelity or commitment to a universal demand. The second concept is the idea that the ethical demand is an unfulfillable demand. It's a demand that cannot be fulfilled. And this is a claim that I borrowed from an obscure Danish theologian. It's always useful to refer to obscure Danish theologians in your work, because no one would have read them, and you can say what you like. But Løgstrup, he wrote a book called The Ethical Demand in 1955, where he tries to show that the fundamental experience of ethics is an experience of an ethical demand, but that demand is, by definition, unfulfillable. And the example of the demand that he gives is the example of Christ's demand in the Sermon on the Mount, which I'll come back to at a certain point.
Does he say it's a demand?
Does Løgstrup say it's a demand? Yeah, the book's called The Ethical Demand.
Okay.
Yeah. Ethical demand. The third concept is that unfulfillable demand is that exorbitant demand, as it were, is one that is internal to my subjectivity. So that the ethical demand isn't just a demand that's out there, it's a demand that I I internalize in a way that divides me from myself. This is my version of the split subject. A little bit different from bad views, but it's still a version of the split subject. And this is a concept that I freely adapt from Levinas. Levinas in the late work, so in the early work, there's this idea of the face of the other as being the fundamental experience of ethics. But in the later work, we get this rich description of the ethical subject. And the ethical subject is the subject who's the subject of a demand that is internalized, but which rends me from myself. So Levinas's problem with autonomy and with sovereignty and all the rest is the risk of a certain satisfaction, risk of a certain complacency. For Levinas, the minute that I say, this is my place in the sun, is the beginning of the usurpation of the entire earth. Right? This is quoting from Pascal. So there has to be a restlessness and anxiety to the ethical subject for Levinas, and I freely adapt that thought. So to put those three thoughts together, three concepts together, my normative claim is that at the basis of any ethics should be a conception of ethical experience that's based on the exorbitant demand of infinite responsibility. And that infinite responsibility is one that I internalize in a way that divides me from myself. Which then leads to the question, which is the question I'm going to pick up this afternoon. Doesn't this sound like self-hatred? Well, yes, and I've got no problem with that. I think there should be a lot more self-hatred of a certain sort. Anyway, but it raises the question, which is the Nietzschean question again. To go back to Freddie, what would prevent this model of the ethical subject being what Nietzsche calls in the genealogy of morals a conscience vivisection? Would be a sort of awful tearing apart of the subject, and that's going to take us into questions of aesthetics, sublimation, tragedy, and humour this afternoon, and I'll try and answer that question.
In your book, Infinitely Demanding, are you not also using Marx to construct your ethical subject? And you use I'm nothing and I want everything?
Yeah, that is the.
I mean, I think your whole chapter 4.
Oh yeah, that's Marx is absolutely central. I think Marx is no, absolutely. I'm hesitating because the formula that you read out, which is from the 1843 text, I'm nothing, I should be something, is that's the formula for the political subject. Right? That's the formula for the proletariat. What is because the question of Marxism and ethics has always been a difficult issue. Right? Marxists are sniffy about ethics because it's bourgeois, whatever, or it's not cool, or it's everything has to be political or socio-economic or whatever. And that seems to me fanciful. So that's the reason I'm hesitating. I mean, but there is a question in which Marx is still committed to an idea of autonomy. Right? Can there be an experience of what I call the heteroaffective or the heteronormative in heteronormative? That's a bad term. The heteroaffective in Marx's work. And that's for me just a question. What's your view?
Well, I mean, based on you were discussing how Lacan, Zizek, all of them have ethics. In a sense, I think you're also saying Marx as an ethics.
I think as an ethics, yeah.
Yeah, so why not also acknowledge that?
Oh, because he doesn't. That's the reason is that he doesn't.
He doesn't acknowledge
Yeah.
it.
So it'd be, but no, it's certainly. I mean, in the early work, it's fairly clear, right? There is this thing called species being. And what is species being in Marx? He gets the term from Bruno Bauer or something. It's there in the 1830s, 40s, kicking around in left Hegelian circles in Germany. But it's some conception of the fully human, right? Some idea of the fully human. And we're alienated from that. So we begin from the postulate of something like Gattungswesen, species being, and some experience of alienation from that species being. Therefore, the demand that's placed on human beings is to try and recover their species being in the early work. In the later work, I think it becomes more tricky to identify that. You could say the following: you could say that because Marx never finished Capital, the volume that was going to be on the theory of the state was never done. It's really unclear what it would have been like anyway.
I mean, even in Capital, there are some passages where he's definitely making a political stand.
Sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm not denying that. But what the ethico-political shape of that would be is, for example, he talks in Capital 1 about an association of free human beings. Right? The ambition for Marx would be an association of free human beings. That's fine. But what would be what would that really look like? What would be the political theory of that? Marx doesn't provide that. Right? And that's has led to all the problems with Marxism after Marx. Is different ways. Well, we don't need that because the logic of history is such that the dialectic of relations and forces of production will produce the outcome of communism. We don't require political theory or ethical theory. I think that's a huge mistake.